Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about drawing the character, and we're going to use a Raylib function called DrawTexturePro. Now, DrawTexturePro is a little different than the DrawTexture functions we've been using in that it allows us to scale the character as well as use the sprite sheet. So before, we were only able to draw a particular rectangle from the sprite sheet without scaling it. So DrawTexturePro has some extra parameters for us. Let's go ahead and get started talking about Draw Texture Pro. Now, Draw Texture Pro takes a few parameters. It takes a texture, which is the sprite sheet itself, as well as a source and a dest rectangle. The source rectangle is a section in the sprite sheet that we wish to draw, and dest is a destination rectangle containing information about where to draw this part of the sprite sheet as well as how big to draw it. Origin is a vector that designates the origin of the texture. Rotation is, well, the rotation of the sprite, and tint is a color if we wish to tint the sprite. Now the texture is simple, it's just the sprite sheet we're using. Now the source is going to dictate which part of the sprite sheet we're going to use. So if we want the second animation frame from the sheet, then this rectangle represents the source. It has an X, which is the local position on the sprite sheet. So in this case, it's going to be this distance here that we're moving to the right. It has a Y, which in this case is going to be 0. This is nothing new. The width, of course, is going to be the width of the sprite sheet divided by 6 in this case, since we have 6 animation frames, and the height is going to be the height of the sprite sheet. Now for the dest rectangle, let's say we have our window here, and we wish to draw the character in the center. Now the X and the Y are going to be the position in the world, and of course we're using the upper left corner of this rectangle. The width is going to be the width of our texture we're drawing in the world, so if we wish to scale it up, we're going to make this value bigger. And the height is of course the height of the texture in the world. The origin is simply a vector 2 local to the rectangle. If we choose the upper left corner, in other words 0, 0, then if we scale this texture, it's going to be scaled relative to that corner. It's also the reference point used if we rotate. So if we pass in a value for the rotation, it'll rotate about the origin vector we choose. Now let's go ahead and set ourselves up to use Draw Texture Pro. Here's our program. Now just under these lines where we're loading the map texture, I'm going to go ahead and create a new texture 2D and call this night. I'm going to initialize it by calling load texture. Now the texture I'd like to load is in the characters folder. We're going to use the sprite sheet in our characters folder called night idle sprite sheet, and that's a .png. Now I'd like to draw the night to the center of the screen, so let's create a vector 2 and call this night pause. And this will be the location on the screen for the night's upper left corner. So if we want the night centered, we'll use window width divided by 2.0 minus half of the night's width. So think about this. This is going to be 0.5 times night.width. Only the sprite sheet has 6 images, so we're dividing this by 6.0. Now for the Y, we're going to use window height divided by 2. And we're also subtracting half of the night's width, so 0.5 times night.height. Now we're using Draw Texture Pro because we want to scale the night image since our sprite sheet is so tiny, and I'd like to scale the night by a factor of 4. So I'm going to take this quantity, which is half of the night's width, and multiply it by 4. I'm also going to multiply this quantity by 4 as well. So now we have the texture and we have the position at which we'd like to draw the night. Now if we hover over the squiggly line, you'll see that we get a pop-up with some messages talking about narrowing conversions of doubles to floats. Now this is because when we use a literal number with decimal values, the compiler considers this to be a double. Hover over this 2.0 and you'll see that we get a pop-up that says double. But if we place an F at the end of this number, suddenly you'll see that the pop-up says float. Placing an F at the end of a number designates that value to be a float value. So we can place an F at the end of all these numbers, and this will make them floats by default. Now hover over night.width, and you'll see that width is an int. So how do we convert this int to a float? Well, we can take any value, and just at the beginning of that value, we can add in parentheses float. What this does is it takes the value to the right and converts it to a float. This is known as a C-style cast, and it comes from the C programming language. Let's add a C-style cast to night.width and night.height. We'll also do this for window width and window height. And now all the values in this vector are floats. So now for your challenge, you're going to draw the character. In the while loop, just after we've drawn the map, you're going to create source and dest rectangles. Use Draw Texture Pro. Now for the source, you're going to use the first frame in the sprite sheet. And for dest, you're going to use the night pause vector for the X and Y. Scale the texture by 4.0f. Use that f suffix to make sure that the 4.0 is a float value. Pause the video and give this a try. So here we're drawing the map, and I'm going to place a comment above this saying draw the map. Now below this, I'm going to place a comment that says draw the character. And we can now create our source and dest rectangles. So we're going to say rectangle source. Now for source, we're going to use the first frame in the animation. So let's use 0.f and 0.f for X and Y. Now for width and height, we need the width and the height of the animation frame. So we're going to use night.width divided by 6. We're going to use 6.f. And for height, we'll use night.height. Now since these are integers, we're going to use a C-style cast to convert them to floats. So we'll use float here and float here. Now we'll make the dest rectangle. So rectangle dest. Now for dest, the X and Y are the location we wish to draw the night in the window. So we're going to use night pause for this. So night pause.x and night pause.y. Now for the width and the height, this is where we can scale the night by 4. So we're going to say 4.0f times night.width divided by 6.0f. And for the height, we'll use 4.0f times night.height. Now, just like with source, we're going to use a C-style cast to convert night.width to a float and night.height to a float. Now let's call Draw Texture Pro. So we'll say Draw Texture Pro. For the texture, we'll use night. For the source, we'll use source. For dest, we'll use dest. And for the origin, we can simply use a 0 vector or a vector with 0 for its x and y. Let's just use the constructor for the vector with braced initialization. That creates a vector with zeros. Now, if you wanted, you could have created a vector here, like this, called origin. And then you could have passed origin in as an argument. If you did that, that would be okay too. We'll get the same result either way. The next parameter is a rotation. We're going to use 0.f. And for the tint, we'll use white. Okay, let's test this out. We'll go to Run and Start Debugging. And here's our window, and we're drawing the texture to the middle of the screen. And the night is scaled by a factor of 4, and we can still move around. Awesome job! Okay, so in summary, we drew the character to the screen, and we used the function drawTexturePro, which allowed us to scale the character and also use a rectangle from the sprite sheet. We scaled the character by a factor of 4.0, and we learned that we could add the f suffix to literal floating point values in order to designate those values to be floats rather than the default double. In the next video, we'll animate the character. I'll see you then.